Welcome everybody to GoLocal Live. I'm Josh Fenton, CEO and co-founder. We're down with the University of Virginia Chair of the Political Science Department, Jennifer Lawless. Thanks, Professor, so much for joining us.
Sure, I'm happy to.
Okay, let's jump into it. Donald Trump, the Republican, in all likelihood nominee, has the number of delegates necessary. He will be crowned at the Republican convention this summer. He's got some legal problems, not as many legal problems as I think many people thought he would have, but he's got a big one, a big money issue coming up on Monday as a result of decisions in the New York court system. He needs to come up with a bond, some way to satisfy the court that he has $460 odd million, and that is a big number. What's the implication of it? What happens if he misses the deadline? And what's the political reality of all this?
Well, in terms of the actual legal side of things, if he doesn't post the $464 million in bond by Monday, Letitia James can actually begin seizing his properties. And so these are properties not only in New York, but any of the assets that he lists. So that's Trump Tower, that could be Bedminster, it could be golf courses globally. It doesn't matter. She can basically begin to acquire property so that that $464 million is met. The other piece of this is political, which is that Donald Trump has portrayed himself as an incredibly wealthy man, an incredibly wealthy billionaire. And it's one thing to say that the courts devalued his assets and accused him of, lying. It's another to not be able to have the resources that he's claimed for decades to have to get himself out of this mess. And, this is a situation where he's going to have to figure out how to thread that needle and convey to his donors and his supporters that he hasn't been lying about his financial standing this whole time. He's already trying to campaign, and he's sending out fundraising emails to try and raise the bond. And that sort of flies in the face of the position he's claimed to have been in for his entire life.
Well, there's a lot of nuances to the story, right? I mean, first and foremost is that he is not liquid enough to be able to come up with $460 million. Depending on whichever valuation has been given to his overall net worth, he's worth a couple billion, 4 billion, whatever the number is. It's not unusual that somebody doesn't have $400 million in cash or the ability to sort of flesh that out, especially if you're a real estate guy in New York in a down market. So that's not unusual.
So that might not be unusual, but what he is finding is problematic is that he's not able to leverage his properties to get money. So a normal person might be able to take out a second mortgage so that they can get assets out of the properties that they have. He's asking for such a huge amount of money that nobody is able to provide that kind of liquidity for him.
Okay, so let's jump over to the second issue. The money's coming into the campaign coffers. A lot of that money is then going out to pay legal bills, right? So it's sort of constant fundraising only for the purposes of playing defense in legal matters. That doesn't help his effort come November, correct?
Right. So for every dollar that he's spending on lawyers, on his legal defense, or at this point, if he winds up using any of that money to try and get himself closer to the 464 million, those are dollars that are not being spent on campaign ads, on direct mail, on door-to-door and ground game operations. Now, it's a little bit less significant in this political environment than in the past because super PACs do so much campaigning on behalf of candidates that it's not like Joe Biden's going to have this robust campaign and Donald Trump will have nothing. But by basically ceding control to a super PAC, he does wind up with less control over his own message.
Yeah, and his way of getting messages out is distinct from what the historical TV big spend was of previous presidential campaigns. Now it's much more about social media, tactical cable television buys, etc.
That's right. And, if he were running for a House seat or a Senate race, I don't really think it would matter. But it's very difficult to do that nationally and get more people on board. So I'm pretty confident that his base is not going to abandon him.
Right.
That, the people that are partisan leaners, so, people who say they're independent but lean Republican, are probably going to vote for him. And the strategy that he's used to communicate with these people is probably adequate. But that's not going to be enough. That's not enough for either Biden or Trump heading into November in 2024. It's about turnout, and it's about those independent voters. And I don't know if he's going to have the capacity himself and his own team to sway those independent voters. Again, the super PACs will likely be able to step in.
Okay, let's jump over to these other broader legal issues that are now.
Oh, wait, can I say one other thing?
Please.
Joe Biden has had an unprecedented series of months in terms of campaign fundraising. So it's not only that Donald Trump is not going to have the money that he might have expected to have, but every single story and every single news article about that also mentions that Joe Biden has been able to raise an insane amount of money, largely from small donors. And then there's a clause in all of those stories that says, and that's a good indicator of momentum. So Donald Trump's financial woes are buttressed by, or I guess the opposite of buttressed by, Joe Biden's ability to fundraise in the early months of the race.
Yeah, Joe Biden raised over $50 million, I believe, both in January and February, has combined about $150 million cash on hand. You take that over to Twin River here in Rhode Island, let it fly, and see if you can turn it into some real money.
$19.99.
Let's jump over to the former president's other legal issues. There's Jack Smith, there's Atlanta, which I think many people thought the Georgia lawsuit would be in primetime TV by now. That's now still in orders of magnitudes of questions. There's the New York prosecutor separate and apart from this claim. There's a lot of things. Oh, the Florida documents case, I may have forgotten one or two, but those are all sort of festering out there. It does not seem like, for the layperson me, that any of these things are actually going to be in a courtroom and a judge or a jury is going to make a decision on any of them prior to the 2024 presidential election.
It's seeming unlikely. The New York case, both sides wanted a 3-week extension to review discovery, for discovery to review additional evidence. So, I mean, maybe that one will be, but that's the least interesting, important, and detrimental to Donald Trump. The Georgia case is a perfect example of, attorneys behaving badly. And the Fani Willis, sexcapades basically derailed the case. She's able to stay on, but Donald Trump is now able to appeal that decision to have her stay on, and that makes it almost impossible for the case to see the inside of a courtroom before November.
And she's not coming out of this looking so good either.
No, because I think that even if people say, and I mean, I believe this, that sort of what goes on behind closed doors in your personal life is probably not that relevant. When you are at the head of what is probably the most important and the easiest case, the most compelling case, heading into the 2024 election, you need to cross every I, dot every T, and behave. This was just, it was irresponsible. It was behavior that's obviously unbecoming of, any sort of high profile elected official, but it also gave Trump a lifeline that I don't think anybody expected him to get.
Let's jump over to Congress. Many members, both on the Republican and Democratic side, are not running for re-election. Colorado Representative Buck not only is not running for re-election, he just up and quit. I believe Friday is his last day. He's not hanging around. He's been kind of this outspoken maverick amongst the Republicans. You're never quite sure how to pin him down on almost any issue. Is this just the reality of how horrible Congress is to serve in right now?
Part of it is, but I should note that, Buck's departure is a real knife in the side to Republicans, because it changes their margin again. They even have a smaller margin now. So they're literally down to the smallest margin they could possibly have. I look, for a long time, members of Congress who thought that they were going to face a really difficult re-election battle, or who had been redistricted and were going to be facing another incumbent, would often retire. Members of Congress who had reached a career ceiling, so they had sort of gotten as high as they were going to get, and maybe their party lost control, were likely to retire. But we've gotten to the point now where there are a lot of members of Congress who feel like it's impossible to get anything done. This is particularly in the House, regardless of the side of the aisle that you're on. And it's one attack from the other side against, you constantly, and it's just not worth it. And I think a lot of people look around and decide, there's no point in doing this anymore. Now, I mean, the overall number of the proportion of members of Congress seeking reelection is still, 75%. And the overwhelming majority of those, above 90 probably, will get reelected. So it's not like there's this crisis out there. But the numbers are, the retirements are greater than they've been in the past, and not necessarily for the reasons that members in the past have chosen to leave.
There was a primary in Ohio this week relative to the United States Senate race. There was the Donald Trump candidate, and then there was much more of a mainstream Republican candidate that I believe the governor supported and Portman supported, and then there was a third Republican candidate. The Trump candidate beat the other two, the mainstream Republican and the third Republican, with the majority of the vote. Got over 50% of the primary vote, at least last numbers I saw. Is this another indication of forget the Tafts, forget Teddy Roosevelt, forget John Chafee, forget the Rockefellers? This Republican Party is 100% under the control of Donald Trump.
Well, so maybe, but I don't think that Donald Trump should break his arm patting himself on the back for this one, because the Democrats intervened in this race and spent an insane amount of money to get this guy elected, because they thought that he'd be their best shot to compete against Sherrod Brown in November. And so this is one of the early cases in 2024 where Democratic party leaders and elected officials are willing to intervene in Republican primaries to ensure that they get the candidate they want to compete against. And so, it makes for strange bedfellows. And it's a risky strategy, because if this guy ultimately does beat Sherrod Brown, it's way worse for the Democrats than if the establishment candidate would in terms of governing. But it's a risk that worked for them pretty well in 2022, and it looks like they're going to give it another shot. So I don't think that the victory can be attributed solely to Donald Trump. That said, there were enough voters out there who were willing to cast their ballots for this candidate. So there is something to be said that, this is Donald Trump's party.
Okay, let's go to the Jeopardy answer. Does Sherrod Brown hold on to that seat in Ohio, a key race for Democrats to keep control of the United States Senate?
I think he will, for a couple of reasons. The first is that it's one of the seats that the Democrats need, and so the Democrats will be campaigning there and putting forward a national effort there, the same way that they have in other states in other years, like what they did in Georgia in 2020 and then again in 2022, and it's possible to do. Also, Biden will be on the ticket, and that will motivate, hopefully, higher levels of turnout among Democrats than a Senate race typically would. Now, the Democrats were unable to win statewide last election cycle, but it wasn't a presidential election campaign, and control of the Senate it didn't go through the state of Ohio.
Yeah, and listen, Donald Trump beat Joe Biden pretty badly in Ohio.
Right. Well, the other thing is, Sherrod Brown has won statewide multiple times. So although the circumstances have changed and the demographics have changed, he's an Ohio Republican who knows how to, communicate with Ohio
Democrat.
Voters. I'm sorry, he's an Ohio Democrat who knows how to communicate with Ohio voters. And he's been a reliable Democrat, right? This is not a Joe Manchin situation in West Virginia where he had there's not an obvious disconnect between the party label and his views. So if he can get Democratic turnout up, he can probably hold on to the seat.
Last question. The map seems to be shifting a little bit. It's now Nevada, Arizona, and Michigan. Maybe a little less Wisconsin, Pennsylvania than it had been in the last two previous elections. Is this really coming down to those two southwestern states, big Hispanic demographics, and Michigan again being a battleground state that's going to decide who the next president is?
I mean, look, if I were on the Biden campaign team right now, I would tell them that they should assume nothing about Wisconsin, or Pennsylvania. So I think
or Georgia.
Or Georgia, obviously Georgia. I mean, I think the same general states are in play that have been in play before. And this far out, the polls are really difficult to interpret because we don't really have a good sense of what voter turnout is going to look like. We also don't really know what the political environment is going to look like, in November. But I certainly don't think that the Democrats should be declaring victory in any of the battleground states that were on the map in 2020.
Finally, what should people be looking at? I mean, it is obviously a combative period of time, but it's also not a very productive period of time in American politics at the national level. What should Rhode Islanders be looking at on this chessboard across the country?
Well, it's an election year because the Democrats and the Republicans did come together and pass a budget that gets us through the fiscal year. So they clearly want to start campaigning and focusing on races as opposed to, whether the government's going to stay open. And that's generally a good thing for programs across the country and for the American people. But, I think it's pretty much going to be campaigning all the time between now and November. And the one sort of wild card policy that I think is still really, that's going to be at the forefront has to do with Israel and Gaza and where we are on that front. The administration has made it clear that they are not going to support the efforts of Benjamin Netanyahu moving forward if he continues down the same path that he's been. And, it's a domestic policy position that will be helpful to Joe Biden. Without question, and it's probably more consistent with where the entire global community falls. But it also opens up a big can of worms in the general region in the Middle East, and so I think there's going to be a lot of uncertainty emerging.
Professor Lawless, University of Virginia, sorry about your basketball team getting blown out in the early game of the NCAA tournament. Fueled the fire that the Big East teams were done wrong by not being selected. A number of Big East teams, including Providence College, did not get a slot. UVA did get a slot and then got blown out. So we pass. Yeah, we pass along our sympathies to the entire UVA community down there in Charlottesville. For everybody else, stay tuned. There is a lot going on. GoLocal's already got a couple of major updates on the site today. Stay tuned for much, much more. There will be a significant story breaking in probably the next hour. Thanks, everybody. Stay safe.